Hi, everybody. This week we're going to be diving into utilitarianism. So we're going to cover some key concepts of act and rule utilitarianism. We'll compare and contrast those a little bit. We'll be examining some of the contributors to utilitarianism, and that is Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mill, J.J.C. Smart, and John Locke. So let's get started with talking about what we will learn in this lecture. So some key things you should be able to do after listening to the lecture is define utilitarianism and understand its core principles. Be able to distinguish between act and rule utilitarianism. Analyze the philosophical contributors Bentham, Mill, Smart, and Locke, and then critically evaluate strengths and limitations to utilitarian approaches. So first, let's define utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is a form of consequentialism. It's a moral theory that evaluates our actions based on their outcomes. The central claim is that the morally right action is one that maximizes our overall happiness or pleasure and minimizes suffering. So some of the key concepts involved with that would be utility, or the net balance of pleasure over pain. Hedonism, which would mean that pleasure is the only intrinsic good and pain the only intrinsic bad. Impartiality, that everyone's happiness counts equally. And consequentialism, that only outcomes matter in determining moral rightness. So that's really a key thing to think about when reflecting on utilitarian ideas, and you'll see why as we get further into the lecture. So one of the key contributors to utilitarian thinking was Jeremy Bentham, who lived between 1748 and 1832, just to give you some context. And his core idea, he was the founder of a classical utilitarianism. So he proposed that the principle of utility, advocating for actions, maximizes overall happiness. One of his famous quotes is, "The greatest happiness of the greatest number, that is the measure of right and wrong." So he developed this idea of the hedonic calculus, which is a method to quantify pleasure and pain across several different dimensions. Some of these dimensions are intensity, duration, certainty, and we can get into that hedonic calculus in a little while. So he believed that all pleasures were qualitatively equal and only quantity mattered. He advocated for legal and political reform based on these utilitarian principles. And as you'll see, most of our policy making today is based on these utilitarian ideas and the utilitarian calculus. So some people criticized his ideas as being kind of too mechanical and too quantitative. And they failed to account for justice, rights, or the quality of pleasures. So that's something to think about and reflect on for your journal. In contrast to that, we have John Stuart Mill. He lived in between 1806 and 1873. So you can see that his ideas are going to build on what Bentham has already done. So Mill refined Bentham's utilitarianism by introducing qualitative distinctions between pleasures. So he's distinguished between the higher pleasure, which would be intellectual, and the lower pleasures, which would be bodily pleasures. So he emphasized that moral education and individual liberty were essential to maximizing utility. And he defended utilitarianism in his essay, Utilitarianism and Political Ideas on Liberty. And one of his famous quotes is, it is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig being satisfied. So let's go back a little to intellectual pleasure versus lower bodily pleasure. So he really did place one in this hierarchy above the other. So if you were just focusing on bodily pleasures or more hedonistic pleasures, sex, drinking, fun, those types of things, if you're focused on those aren't really going to count as being good utilitarian principles to be acting towards. Instead, you should be thinking about gaining wisdom, education, and knowledge. And he sees those as better fitting to benefiting ourselves. And so Mill wasn't really a strict rule utilitarian. And I'll go into some comparisons and contrasts between the two here in a minute. But he did open the door to sort of this rule-based reasoning by an emphasis on justice and rights. So let's talk a little bit about the differences between act and rule utilitarianism. So let's go through a definition first. Act utilitarianism means that we judge each action by its individual consequences, whereas rule utilitarianism means that we judge actions by whether they conform to rules that maximize utility. So you can see one is more individually based and situational, and the other is more universal in nature. So flexible, how flexible are both? So act utilitarianism is very highly flexible because each act is considered on its own, in its own context, in its own situation. Thereby, rule utilitarianism would be lower on the flexibility scale because we need to follow rules, even if breaking them might yield a better immediate result. So an example of act utilitarianism would be that lying is acceptable if it leads to more happiness in that situation. On the rule side of things, lying would be wrong because as a general rule, lying does not promote more happiness. So there are some criticisms of both theories, and I'll just point out one for each right now, and we can dive more deeply into this in our discussions. But one criticism of act utilitarianism is that we have to ask ourselves, can we justify morally repugnant acts? Can we sacrifice the one for the many? And that comes to the trolley problem, which many of you have probably heard of the trolley problem, and it's mentioned in our chapter. The train is going down the tracks, and you have the opportunity to switch the direction of the train and kill just one person in order to save many people. So that's kind of the standard way of thinking about act utilitarianism. On the rule side of things, a criticism might be that it can collapse into act utilitarianism, or it could become too inflexible or too rigid for us to make progress. So let's take a look at what J.J. Smart said about it. Now we're moving into some more contemporary thinking. J.J. C. Smart lived between 1920 and 2012. And his core idea, he was a strong proponent of act utilitarianism in the 20th century. And his key points were that the rule utilitarianism is just really superstitious rule worship. So think of some of our other rule-based theories that we've talked about in class so far. Divine command theory is rule-based, but moral relativism is more flexible. And you'll see later when we get into Kant that Kant is more rule-based. So you can see throughout the course that we sort of have this juxtaposition or contrast between the individual versus the group. And who should we emphasize? Which is better? Should we maintain autonomy? Should we make rules that benefit the group more? And what happens if we make rules that benefit the majority but that harm the minority? And we see that in a lot of our policy making. So it's important to understand how utilitarianism plays a role in our culture and society. So J.J.C. Smart also believed that only consequences of particular actions matter. So rules are just rules of thumb. So he defended utilitarianism in a modern analytic philosophy, and he was against Kantian deontology, and he was against ideas on virtue ethics. A famous critique of his idea would be that by following rules blindly can lead to worse outcomes, and this violates the core utilitarian aim. But let's take a look now about John Locke. Now we're going further back in time. John Locke lived between 1632 to 1704. So Locke is not really a utilitarian in the classical sense. He was kind of misclassified. He was more a natural rights theorist, as we saw in our previous lecture, but he believed in the inherent rights to life, liberty, and property, and those would be our natural rights. But some scholars argue that Locke's political philosophy influenced utilitarian thinkers, especially Mill, because Locke focused on the social contract and the greatest good for society. So here you can see how they might come together. Unlike utilitarians, though, Locke believed that rights are inalienable, and that means they are not subjected to utilitarian calculations. So we are born with them, and that would put him back into the natural rights category. So Locke believed that rights are prior to utility, and that rights are instrumental to maximizing happiness. And you see a lot of Locke's ideas are in our Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. So our founding fathers relied heavily on Locke and other utilitarian thinkers when they were constructing our system of government. So let's talk a little bit about some of the strengths of utilitarianism. It's democratic. Everyone's happiness counts. It's action guiding. There are clear decision-making principles. It's flexible. It's scalable. However, there are some weaknesses. It's difficult to calculate all possible consequences that will occur as the result of making a decision. It can violate some people's individual rights, and it can neglect justice and fairness. So in the real world, what does that mean? Public policy and cost-benefit analysis most often support the majority and leave the minority behind. And one way that we can see that is in popular thinking versus, popular thinking during the current time period. For example, there was a particular time period where popular thinking said that slavery was okay. So in order to maximize the greatest good for everyone, we allowed slavery to occur. As you can see, this is definitely a weakness of the utilitarian principle. We could also apply this to medical ethics and what the best situation would be for the greatest good. Let's take an example here, COVID-19. So utilitarians were trying to prioritize the greatest good by stating that all people should be vaccinated. But not everybody believed in vaccinations. And so the minority, or those that were against vaccinations, would not have benefited from this. And it also leaves out autonomy. it takes away our individual choice. And one last, real world application, and there are many, and you'll see them as you go through the rest of the class, would be in environmental ethics. So some people believe that we should all be striving towards environmentally sound practices in our businesses, in our personal choices, and that's for the greater good and for our people that live on into the future, our children, our great-grandchildren, our great-great-grandchildren. As we go forward, we want to preserve our environment, but not everybody believes that we should be doing this. Some people do not believe in global warming and climate change. Some people do not believe in business practices that are more geared towards environmental protection because they may hurt their bottom line. So those are just a few of the real world applications that you can use utilitarianism and apply that. It's really the most practical way of applying theory to practice. So some discussion questions for your journal on these topics. Number 1, can utilitarianism ever justify immoral actions? Torture to prevent terrorism, for example. Number 2, do you agree with Smart that rule utilitarianism collapses into act utilitarianism? And the third thing to reflect on this week would be, how might Miller respond to concerns about violating rights for the greater good? So that just gives us a brief overview of utilitarianism, which is a very complex topic, and I can't wait to dive into our discussions to see what you think about each of our main ideas.